This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 180 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We've got a lot to get to on today's show with injuries and weirdness happening all across the NFL. But before we dig into this week's transactions, I wanted to let you guys know about a special offer from NumberFire. With the NFL, NBA, and NHL all in full swing, NumberFire Premium has you covered. With award-winning DFS tools, advanced stats, and expert content, Premium has everything you need to dominate across all three sports. If you're a new user, try it out and get your first month for only $7.95 with promo code CLUTCH. That's promo code CLUTCH. Visit numberfire.com/premium for more details. Add Kenyon Barner. Sony Michel left Sunday's game in the second quarter with a knee injury, and that's pretty scary given his history. Fortunately, it does sound like he avoided a serious issue with his knee. So James White benefited from this injury most. He played 70.3% of New England snaps, and he led the team with 11 rushes. It was actually just the second time that he's hit double-digit carries in his 54-game career. But Kenyon Barner would see an uptick in work without Sony Michel in that backfield. He carried the ball 10 times on Sunday with a 27% snap share. Now watch and see what the Patriots do this week to beef up the running back group. They might go after someone like Mike Gillislee, who already knows the system, or maybe they get a guy like Orleans Darkwa, who was really good last season, but hasn't gotten a call from a team. But it does sound like Sony Michel's going to miss some time, and if he does miss some time, Kenyon Barner is going to benefit. Sell Kerryon Johnson. I hate talking about selling talented players in fantasy football. You guys know, if you listen to the show, I love Kerryon Johnson. I've been talking about irrational coaching on this show with Kerryon Johnson for a while now. But that's the thing, we can't expect rational coaching in Detroit. Let's look at what happened in Week 7. Everything kind of came together nicely. Theo Riddick was out, which helped Johnson see the highest snap share that he's seen all season long. He had a 59.4% snap share. He saw 3 targets, which might not seem like a lot, but Matthew Stafford only threw the ball 22 times. Those 3 targets actually ended up being a 14% target share. And then there was the matchup. Going into Week 7, Miami had allowed a top 12 RB1 performance to a running back in every game that they've played. So the matchup was there, and the lack of Theo Riddick helped too. That's why if you joined my Facebook Live on the FanDuel Facebook page on Sunday morning, you heard my Kerryon Johnson love. It was because of those 2 things, the matchup and no Theo Riddick. But the thing that's hurting Kerryon Johnson long-term is his goal line work. It's LeGarrette Blount. It's rational coaching. Johnson did see 3 carries within the Dolphins' 10-yard line on Sunday. That's great. LeGarrette Blount only had 1. But guess what? LeGarrette Blount scored. Kerryon Johnson on those 3 carries had 0 yards. I think you have to be afraid that coaches will still want to utilize LeGarrette Blount in that role given this small sample. The Lions are also facing the Seahawks, Vikings, Bears, Panthers, and Bears again over their next 5 games. That's not the easiest month plus of matchups. So I do think that Kerryon Johnson will provide a weekly floor. He's a great running back. And that's something that's not easy to find at the running back position in fantasy football. But I do still have concerns about his usage moving forward, and he's coming off a big game, which is why I'm talking about him as a sell. Add Tre'Quan Smith. Finally, it's happening. I've been talking about Tre'Quan Smith so much on this podcast this year, and it looks like it's finally happening. With Ted Ginn on injured reserve, Tre'Quan Smith stepped up for the Saints in Week 7. He played 73.2% of the team's snaps. That was the second highest rate among wide receivers on the Saints, behind only Michael Thomas. And according to Pro Football Focus, he was second on the team in routes run at the wide receiver position as well. It makes sense for Tre'Quan Smith to fill in for Ted Ginn. He can stretch the field. He saw 6 targets on Sunday, and while that might not be a consistent number week in and week out, there's still plenty of upside given the offense that he's in. He won't need a ton of volume to be viable in fantasy anyway, because so far this year, he's got a really good 14.1 ADOT. You want to get Tre'Quan Smith on your roster this week. Hold David Johnson. I feel like I haven't talked about any player more on this 15 Transactions podcast this year than David Johnson. I've been talking about him as a sell candidate, but now obviously I'm talking about him as a hold because Arizona finally fired Mike McCoy. He's finally gone. But I still don't think David Johnson is this slam dunk obvious buy. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that an offensive coordinator change will help David Johnson. I mean, if you look at the NFL's next-gen stats run charts that they produce, David Johnson just running up the middle over and over and over again all season long. Mike McCoy is a horrendous offensive coordinator. But the main issue with David Johnson is twofold. First, touchdown regression is still going to hit. He didn't find the end zone this past week, but based on his 335 rushing yards, he should have closer to 2 or 3 touchdowns rather than the 5 that he has. That's based off of how running backs have scored over the last 7 years. But I think the bigger concern with David Johnson is, are we sure that he's going to see more work through the air? Because he needs that in order to be a true RB1 in fantasy football. Now, we know the Cardinals' offense has struggled, and even with a new offensive coordinator, there's no guarantee they'll become like a top half offense in the league. So if that doesn't happen, if they're not a top half offense, David Johnson needs some volume. He needs to be fed in a bad offense in order to make up for that inefficiency. And that volume hasn't been there. With Sam Bradford under center this year, Johnson saw 15 of a possible 80 targets. That's an 18.8% target share. Nothing wrong with that. With Josh Rosen, things have been different. He has 15 targets with Rosen under center, but Rosen has thrown 129 passes, lowering Johnson's target share to just 11.6%. That's not a great target share for someone like David Johnson. So I do think there's some worry. Can we just assume that his receiving work will dramatically increase with a new offensive coordinator? Do we even know if Byron Leftwich will be successful? Are we so sure that Arizona will do this 180 and become reliable from a fantasy football perspective? I think it's reasonable to be optimistic. I'm optimistic about this offense too. But optimism doesn't score fantasy points. Actual production does. Add Courtland Sutton. So Courtland Sutton's actually had a pretty decent snap share in Denver this season. He's played only 26 fewer snaps than Demaryius Thomas has. He hasn't been all that relevant in fantasy football though, but that could change given the rumors floating around that the Broncos are looking to trade Demaryius Thomas. If that happens, Courtland Sutton immediately becomes Denver's number 2 target. That should boost him into more of an every week role on your fantasy football squad. Now, I don't know if a trade's going to happen. I have zero inside information, but it's worth it to stash Sutton and see if something goes down. But he also has the chance to break out without a deal getting done. His air yards profile really isn't that far off from Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. He just hasn't converted like they have. Buy Doug Baldwin. So on last week's 15 Transactions podcast, I talked about Tyler Lockett as a sell candidate. And that still holds true. Lockett scored a touchdown for every 72 yards receiving this year, when the league average at wide receiver over the last 7 years has been a touchdown scored on every 167 receiving yards. If someone is valuing Tyler Lockett as a player who can maintain that pace, then send Tyler Lockett away. Doug Baldwin's not exactly in the same boat. The last time we saw Seattle play, Baldwin saw 8 of a possible 23 Russell Wilson targets, which was good for almost a 35% target share. Now, he's been banged up this year, but he's also coming off a bye week where he was able to rest up. And while being in a run-first offense isn't very attractive, Seattle's upcoming schedule could dictate a more pass-happy approach. They get the Lions this week in Detroit, then they'll face the Chargers, Rams, and Packers. So if Baldwin continues to see a high target share like we saw in week 6 or close to that high of a target share, then he should benefit from overall volume. Add Doug Martin and Jalen Richard. So the Raiders are likely to be without Marshawn Lynch for a pretty long time. That means backups Doug Martin and Jalen Richard should get more run in the offense. And both players need to be added. They're rostered in just 17% of ESPN.com leagues right now. But the question that all of you are asking right now is, which one of these guys should I pick up? Doug Martin or Jalen Richard? I think in short, if you're playing in a PPR league, my choice off the waiver wire is Jalen Richard. And the reason for that is because he's sort of been a receiving machine this year. Entering week 7, only 9 running backs across the entire league had a higher target share than Jalen Richard. Anytime the Raiders have been in negative game scripts, Richard has been their man in the backfield. Now let's take Marshawn Lynch out of the equation. Does Doug Martin step in and take all of Marshawn Lynch's workload? Yeah, I think that's possible. That's certainly possible. But for every bit that Martin doesn't take from Marshawn Lynch, that's an opportunity for Jalen Richard. It's an opportunity for Richard to see more early down work, all while having that late game hurry up role. It makes sense if you would prefer Doug Martin in a standard format. That's fine. He's probably going to see the goal line work, and I'd be shocked if he doesn't see the majority of early down work in that offense. But don't overlook Jalen Richard, especially if you're getting points per reception. Buy the Rams passing attack. If you're feeling a little bit down about Los Angeles' passing attack after a mediocre performance in a plus matchup against the 49ers, you got to chill out. things are going to get better. Because in 3 of their next 4 games, they'll face the Packers, Saints, and the Chiefs. So in other words, we're going to see a lot of scoring in those 3 games. So whether it's Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks, who I had as a buy last week, or maybe even Jared Goff, you should be buying this passing offense. Add Ronald Jones. There's some vagueness surrounding an injury that occurred to Peyton Barber on Sunday. And then those question marks were sort of reinforced when head coach Dirk Cutter confirmed that there was indeed an injury. But we just don't know how serious it is. So don't wait, just be aggressive. Add Ronald Jones, who possesses big play upside despite his pass catching and pass protection flaws as a prospect. You guys know I'm not the biggest Ronald Jones fan in the world, but there is upside there. He's a big play waiting to happen. So if Barber misses time, Ronald Jones should have an opportunity to prove himself. Buy Josh Gordon. The peripherals are all there for Josh Gordon right now. Over the last 2 weeks, only Julian Edelman has played more snaps at wide receiver for the Patriots, and he's played just 10 more than Josh Gordon. And during this time, Gordon is second on the team with 16 targets. James White is first with 17. And Gordon leads the Patriots with a 34% air yard share. And his 11.6 average depth of target is first on the team during this time period. So everything is pointing up for Josh Gordon. You should buy him now because the touchdowns will naturally come. Hold Andy Dalton. Trust me, guys, I was probably hurt more by Andy Dalton this week in fantasy football than any of you. But in fantasy football, sometimes you just got to push those bad performances aside. You got to realize that variance exists. So don't give up on Dalton just yet, because over the next 2 weeks, the Bengals will be at home against the Buccaneers and then the Saints. Throughout this 2018 season, Tampa Bay's allowed the most points to opposing passers, while the Saints rank 3rd worst. I do think that Andy Dalton is going to bounce back. Sell Amari Cooper. So the Cowboys traded a 1st-round pick for Amari Cooper on Monday. They did need a true number 1 wideout, but this is a move that has more opportunity to help in real football than in fantasy football. Not only will it take Cooper time to get acclimated with his new team, but Dallas isn't exactly a great place for fantasy football wideouts. They're averaging the 4th fewest pass attempts per game, they're 29th in pace, and they're 21st in situation neutral pace. I mean, in sum, the offense is slow and run heavy. It's the complete opposite of what you want for your fantasy football wide receiver. Therefore, you should be selling Amari Cooper. Add Malcolm Brown and Spencer Ware. I only draft handcuffs in deeper formats because they don't pan out at the rate that most think that they do. We're also not that great at predicting who backup running backs will be at the beginning of the season. But with that being said, this is the time of year to start snagging the higher end handcuffs off the waiver wire. And that's even if you're not rostering those handcuffed backs. If something were to happen to Todd Gurley, and please don't let anything happen to Todd Gurley, Malcolm Brown and maybe John Kelly would become very reasonable fantasy assets. If Kareem Hunt goes down, again, I don't want Kareem Hunt to get hurt, trust me, then Spencer Ware is instantly a starter in fantasy football. Even if you don't have Todd Gurley and Kareem Hunt, you can get their handcuffs. Because realistically, they are some of the best flyers out there. So if you have a roster spot, add Malcolm Brown and add Spencer Ware. And there might be other handcuffs that you're comfortable with as well. Add Derek Carr. So real talk, you guys, quarterback streaming this week is rough. It's so rough that Derek Carr may be the top traditional option. You know, if Mitch Trubisky is out there, then sure, go get Mitchell Trubisky. But he's now rostered in about 50% of leagues. But Derek Carr, he's now without the aforementioned Amari Cooper, but the Raiders are at home this week taking on the Colts in a game with a 50.5 point over-under. Indy's been pretty average against the pass on a per-play basis this year, but before their Week 7 game against a third-string quarterback, they had allowed 7 touchdown passes and an average of 332 passing yards from Weeks 4 through 6. It's not like it's a great defense. So if you're forced to play Carr, it won't be pretty, but with so few options out there, he's one of the top streamers this week. Add the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. There's a lot of good defensive plays this week, but those defenses are also rostered at a pretty high rate right now. You'll want to play New England against Buffalo, Arizona's D isn't a bad play against San Francisco, and Houston's a pretty good play as well. But I like the Steelers. They're only owned in 13% of ESPN.com leagues, and they've got a good matchup against the Browns. Only Baltimore is averaging more sacks per game than Pittsburgh is, and no squad in football has surrendered more sacks than Cleveland has this year. With the Browns playing in Pittsburgh as big underdogs, the Steelers are a very strong streaming play. As always, I've got a 16th transaction on the podcast that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column over on NumberFire, and this week's 16th transaction is sort of a combination of 2 players, and it's to add Devontae Booker and Trenton Cannon. I don't consider either of these guys high-end handcuffs, but depending on how things pan out with injuries in their respective backfields, maybe they'll warrant a flex play in your particular league. Royce Freeman's dealing with an ankle injury, and Bilal Powell has a neck injury. I'd prioritize Cannon over Booker, but both are still deeper adds considering the offenses that these guys are in, and the fact that they won't be their team's lead backs. But who knows, maybe someone like Cannon will hit if Bilal Powell is out. That's going to be it for today's show. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.